Hi, my name's leowt, and you have found your way to the Conversations podcast. Conversations exist to create spiritually minded conversations about life. We desire to create safe space for dialogue and community. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to generate conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Everyone is welcome at the conversation. Friends, how are you? It's leowt, and this is Conversations. So, if you're new here, hi, hello,
Friends,
how are you? Well, it's myself talking. If you're new here, hey, hi, hello, how are you? My name's leowt, and I would like to welcome you to Conversations, where we gather together regularly and intentionally to have spiritually minded conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. The most important part of that statement is that absolutely everybody's voice is welcome at the conversation. Also, a quick note, when I say spiritually minded, I'm not necessarily tying ourselves to religion, but I'm referring to the things that go beyond surface level conversation and really make us think about the what's and the whys and the hows of the world. So that's why we're here today. I have a really dope conversation lined up, and I'm incredibly excited to get started, but I want to make a little bit of an acknowledgement first. For the first time, really, since I've been running Conversations, we have 2 concurrent days running that are incredibly important in my mind. And so I want to make an acknowledgement of the one while we move on to discuss the other. So today is Indigenous Peoples Day, and we're going to be talking to my new friend, Justin, about Indigenous Peoples Day, why it matters, why it means more than just semantics, and why Christopher Columbus was a jackass. But also, today is also National Coming Out Day. And so I would be remiss to not mention that, there are lots of people who find themselves stuck in the closet, having trouble to come out. And today is supposed to be a day to encourage those people who can come out to come out, and to encourage those people that are in the closet that they matter also. I think it's a salient point of conversation to realize that coming out is kind of a binary distinction that's forced upon queer people by colonization in large part. So I see this as honestly a perfectly intersectional conversation, meaning that, white people kind of suck, and they did a lot of crappy things to a lot of Indigenous peoples across the world and in America, and they forced artificial binaries that did not exist in a lot of Indigenous cultures. So we will be celebrating National Coming Out Day. I do have a bunch of stories to share with you from my lovely, fabulous, diverse, intersectional queer friends, and those will be forthcoming. But today we're going to press pause on the National Coming Out Day conversation, and we're going to engage in a conversation about Indigenous Peoples Day. So that is my caveat and acknowledgement. Queers, I have not forgotten you, but I think perhaps this conversation might actually be kind of foundational to why we find ourselves needing to come out in the first place. So here we go. As I said, I'm leowt. I'm a hairdresser, a professional queer, consummate scholar of religion who just got out of a 5-hour class on the intersections of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I like to talk. And so I decide to have these conversations that I would love to have over coffee. I decide to publish them and put them out in the world. So that's me. Enough about me. I'm going to let my friend introduce himself. If you want to take it away, we can let the people know who you are.
Hey everybody, my name is Justin Schapp, and I am a Seneca Deer Clan citizen, and I'm living out here on Ohio, which is a beautiful river territory of the Onondaga. And I'm really happy to be here talking to Leo. I do want to say that if it's coming out day too, it's all about sharing and caring and getting more conversations about multiple days, and I think we're going to be able to find a connection, because personally I was unaware it's coming out day, but so you kind of given me that inspiration. But as soon as you said it, I got a connection that hit my mind, and I'm ready to talk about not just Indigenous people, but how do we connect Indigenous people to your life, and who are Indigenous people, who were Indigenous people, and who are Indigenous people going to be.
Ooh. Oh,
talk about all
I don't even want to say anything else. I just kind of want to put myself on mute and let you talk for the next hour, if that's like all right.
Well, I'm a talker too, and so
perfect.
I can talk for if you got 25 years, I'd love to talk.
Just a small amount of time, a nominal amount, if you will.
Yeah. Let's talk about Indigenous Peoples Day, because
Yeah, let's start there as our inroad, and then we'll fly off.
what is this day? Why does everybody care about it? It's not even the, we're calling it Indigenous People Day, but I think other people call it Columbus Day still, and in honor of a guy who kind of fumbled his way around and rode some boats. And,
Yep.
But I think I look at Columbus Day and I try to complicate it as much as possible, in that I try not to connect it to Indigenous Peoples Day. Does that make sense? Even though they're on the same day.
Yeah, totally fair.
So, and I'll tell you why. When I was a young man, I went down to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and on my second day, they were tearing down a small statue of De Soto. He was a conquistador, and he was and it was a big deal because I just got down there, and we just protested here for about 6 months on New York State taxing our territory, and we've been an integral part of that protest. And part of my impetus of moving down there was I got into some legal trouble here, so I moved down there and to try to keep myself out of trouble.
Right.
I couldn't stay away. It's like I said, it was like the second day we were there, and I found out about it. I just went right down there, and I remember it took me a while to find out where it was. By the time I got down there, they had already kind of tore the statue down, and I just went over there and grabbed it, tried to yank it around on it. But being in that space was my true active participation in trying to say, here's this conquistador philosophy, here's this stuff that's been hagiographied, this stuff that's been really promoted for years as integral to the American experience, when it really has nothing to do with it. It's just this myth. And here we were able to tear that stuff down. And I'm not going to say what year it is because I'll date myself, but it was plenty of years ago. And so that kind of shaped, I was already an activist. That kind of shaped, like, how do I perceive these kind of events, and how do we perceive the indigenous peoples in relation to people who are promoting perpetual colonization. So that's when I look at Indigenous Peoples Day. Indigenous Peoples Day is saying that, are we going to continue to perpetuate colonization in perpetuity, or are we going to just make conscious decisions to say that we're going to start looking at Indigenous contributions in meaningful ways that kind of tear down those colonial structures, the systems in place. It takes action.
Would you be able to, now this is something that I think would be really interesting for some folks, because I know it's not necessarily in everybody's realm of conversation to discuss like Indigenous and Native American issues, right? But would you be able to like define for us, like just on a foundational level, for folks who might not know what we mean when we say Indigenous peoples and why we say Indigenous peoples?
So I'm complicating these things because there's some deep academic theoretical stuff that we can get into. If you want to do the KISS method, just keep it short and simple. we'll just come right out with it and say Indigenous peoples are all around the world. There's just certain people who decide to move from their indigenous roots and come to another location. They immigrated, they were forced, whatever those methods of transportation, they decided to occupy land that was originally occupied by other people. And so those people who were original, Aboriginal, Native American, Indigenous. But when you talk about Indigenous in North America, you're talking about 592 different types of people, distinct groups just in the United States. Add another 300 across Canada, add another 280 some across Mexico and in the Central America, Mesoamerica, and you just have just a ton of people, just under 1,000 different types of people with all different kinds of cultures, and they may be similar language groups, but they have different practices, different, just a ton of differences. And all those people would be considered indigenous to this continent. However, if you have French background, you're indigenous. You're just indigenous to France.
Mm-hmm.
And then guess what? In France, it's not homogeneous either. So in France, there's all different kinds of people. There's different kind of cultures. It just depends on what region of France. You could be from Vichy, France. Could be from Paris or whatever. You're gonna have different kind of cultures. You have different kinds of activities and perspectives, and all of those have values. So let's just say, you are from, I like Djibouti just because it's the funnest word to say.
Because, right? Exactly, just
Djibouti.
because.
You are indigenous to that location, and to say that you're not, doesn't make sense, because if you're from Djibouti, you don't think that way. You just have this concept that you have a place, you have a belonging, and that's what we're talking about. Indigenous people, that's really what they're saying. Is when we say indigenous people, they're actually, when we make that claim, we are saying that there's a homeland here, and indigenous peoples, specifically in my case, it'd be Onondaga, Seneca people have a homeland here, and that's what makes them indigenous.
I heard this, well, I shouldn't say I heard this, I read this interesting analogy today, right? And it was like this mom talking to a kid or something like that. It was the two people talking back and forth, and the first one goes, "Oh, did you know that Neil Armstrong discovered the moon?"
Oh, yeah.
And the kid's like, "No, the moon was there before." And then they're like, "Exactly." And I think that's kind of,
they're like, "Hey, tell me about Christopher Columbus again. Tell me about."
Exactly. And I think that's the contextualization that I want to give this conversation to, is that for especially in our area, right, the Seneca people, this is their place. This is not the white man came here, right? That was a thing. Like, Christopher Columbus was not indigenous to this area, nor moreover did it suddenly come into existence when he discovered it, right? But there were people here, and like you said, there are almost 1,000 people groups between Canada, United States, and Mexico, because borders are fake. But there's almost 1,000 people groups there, right? And they were all distinct peoples with distinct places, and then people came in to colonize and occupy them.
Yeah, and to be what is the thing that is Seneca, and people like our own people wrestle with that all the time. We have these pretty gaudy arguments about where did we come from, what's our origins, what's our philosophy on these things, and but one thing that we can agree on is that whether we're an amalgamation of different people, which we are, whether we're a nation of nations and different people that kind of have traversed a specific historical time frame over the last 300 years, we can debate all that stuff. But what we don't debate is the homelands of the Seneca are in a specific area, and by the way, we don't actually occupy those. We occupy the fringes of our homelands, and I think a lot of people don't understand that. So we've actually gone through 5 different forced ethnic cleansing practices. A lot of people don't understand that. So people, even our own people don't see that. They don't, because, and the reason why, Leo, is because we teach Christopher Columbus, and we don't necessarily teach the hard history, the hard stuff that really makes people kind of understand it. And it's, for me, I look at it and say, well, it's one thing to just say, well, there's this innocuous term called, white people or something like that. I kind of steer away from that stuff, because I go towards just straight naming it, which is settler colonialism. And the practice of it, the behavior is what we're trying to address, because the people are good. The people are nice. I meet these people all the time. However, they practice settler colonialism. I'm like, what? I don't really. What is this behavior that you're doing? What if you were a kid and you ran up and just punched every single person, if you were a 5-year-old kid and you just punched every single person, you know these kids, right? They just punch you, right? And they're fine. You would probably want that kid to curb that kind of behavior.
Yes.
And you wouldn't hate the kid though. You'd be like, this kid's kind of cool. Actually got a nice punch, but just find another way to kind of steer that behavior. And so that's what I try to do, because far too often, when we do talk about settler colonialism, it's easier then to talk about indigenous peoples, because you're framing it, you're getting that linguistics in there. You're talking about, hey, settler colonialism has a specific frame in your mind.
Yeah.
And if I can,
would you mind fleshing that out for us? Because I think I'm familiar with the phrase, but I would love to, like you said, just frame out the conversation, right?
Yeah, it's Oregon Trail, man. Right? You played Oregon Trail.
Oh, absolutely.
You're my age or younger, you know at least a little bit about Oregon Trail.
Absolutely.
So it's the rugged individual, it's the manifest destiny, it's all those things that you kind of learn, and hopefully those things are real. They actually happened.
Right.
The United States made very specific concerted efforts to continue to carry on the colonial traditions of the English and the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish. Also, China did this, Japan did it. Colonialism is not just specific to, very Eurocentric type people. So the very specific colonial practice of settler colonialism is different. So that's where you're supplanting and replacing in a systematic way the original people that are here, and you're starting to say, well, now I can assume this specific identity by erasure or ethnic cleansing practices or invisibility tactics, or just perpetual colonization. If you're saying, if you had to come in here and just rename everything already had names. Right. And it's a misnomer to say that early colonists spoke English only, because that's a lie. The first colonists had to learn the indigenous languages first, almost to a T. They learned indigenous language and they spoke because they wanted to be able to eat. They wanted to be able to trade.
Very valid. Right?
Yeah, they wanted access. And so they spoke the indigenous languages, or they had people who were there around them, and that was the language that was spoken. It was generally not any other languages were not spoken here, and it makes sense in your mind. So, and that's colonization, right? Is resource extraction, etc. When you settle, then that's settler colonialism. That's when you're saying, I'm supplanting, I'm replacing people that were here in a very systematic way. And so you see this a little bit in Africa with specifically the Dutch, and you see I think Belgium does it, and then you see this in like South Africa in particular, right?
Yeah.
So this idea of the Afrikaner, the idea of the person who's now lived there for 2 generations, now they get to claim settler rights. Right. I have these settler type rights to occupy this space. Rights that weren't there or shouldn't have been recognized, but somehow there's this political status attached to it, and it's the perpetuation of these colonial practices that started up in the 1400s, 1300s, 1200s.
That's an incredibly pertinent point, because I think a lot of times we say white people, and in that we emphasize like Eurocentric behavior anyways, like we're the ones doing this, but this is a practice that happens all over the world. And it just so happens that in our particular context, right, with where we live, we're in a pretty small area between you and I, you know what I mean, rural Western New York, near Lake Erie, we are talking about in our context, European people coming over and, like taking over native cultures here, but this does happen elsewhere in the world.
Sure. And I don't know, like, for example, right now, the colonization is occurring with China and West Africa in particular, because they're coming in. Colonization is a resource extraction model. And so China is coming in there, partnering with the different, African nations along that coast in a similar pattern to extract stuff like rare earth metals, etc. And they're pumping a lot of money in there and expertise, but in exchange, they're doing this resource extraction model where potentially it's out of balance for trade, etc. And so, and then also the same is true, across time, because I'll give you some examples. When we talk about indigenous contributions, I go to corn and I go to rubber, right? And I also go to like the cocoa bean, right? The coffee, right? The coffee bean.
That is a precious material.
These staples of life that are today. We find that they're all horticulturally developed by indigenous peoples over time for very specific uses. So the plants itself, over a period of time, have been horticulturally interacted with by indigenous peoples to create that specific plant for a very specific purpose. Corn is a prime example. So I've watched plenty of movies where they're coming out of like Middle East and stuff, and they're like, "Oh, thanks for this corn," and they hold those ears of corn. I'm like, "What is this? This is amazing!" And little do they know that corn didn't exist there until probably the 1500s, when you see all this massive extraction of foodstuffs based on people who are now inquiring. So I want to go back to, because people always go in and say, well, the contributions of extremely smart European people are what drove this American experience, this enlightenment, right? That's the narrative that's told to everybody. Oh, in political science, it's Kant and it's Adam Smith for economists. It's Franklin for all this other crazy innovative stuff, and then like Thomas Jefferson. And, the list goes on, right? All these, and the list is almost always European. And I'm not saying that they didn't write it down, but they were getting those ideas from someplace else. They were being exposed to something. What was that they were being exposed to? And we see that today in real time, but back then there was no YouTube, there was no TikTok. I watch some TikTok stuff and I see these dancers and I'm like, yeah, that looks cool. I'm gonna go try that. Then I try it and I'm like, I'm terrible at it. But I'm being exposed to things that I haven't seen before, and therefore it is intriguing to me. So if I'm a good writer, I would then go and take those things, polish them up and create something and say, I'm a creator now. I created this. Did you really create it? I don't really believe so. I think what you did is you were able to capture it for your specific audience and produce it for them. Because other people already had it. And I'll give you an example. Democracy and freedoms and all the stuff that you guys talk about today.
Yes.
All that stuff existed here way before, for millennia, for time immemorial. Long time. Now, was it perfect? Probably not. About as less, probably more perfect than this current model that we're in. And we can have great conversations about that. But I hopefully you get to follow me, because for some reason, and it comes to this story, a kind of similar story we talked about. There's another story out there where this guy says, he walks up to this Indian guy and he says, well, tell me about the old days. And he talks about all these things like, oh yeah, we used to go hunting all day and fishing and only the European man thought he could improve upon that. What an idiot. So the idea is that you used to have all these freedoms, democracy, sustainable economies. You had all these things that was prioritized. So being able to exist within yourself, not overtax your environment, live within your specific means, not to have things that are over excessive amounts, not to less focused in on moral turpitudes and really odd things, and more focused in on pleasurable experiences in community settings, right? We had that widespread.
So we're talking particularly in our area about what group of people, where did that come from tangibly before it was, like colonized?
Well, in our area, well, my experience is all Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, and stuff. So in that very specific subset, you have across the Haudenosaunee, you didn't have hunger, you didn't have poverty, you didn't have widespread crime, you didn't have you were generally taken care of. You had your health, your wealth, your societal meaning, your role, your culture, all that stuff was specifically defined within you. And also you had massive amounts of freedom, massive amounts of the ability to move with your feet, the ability to express yourself. Everyone was given a chance to talk. It was actually the I don't want to say it's a utopian society, but it has the idyllic attitude. It does have some negatives in there. There are some things in there that are that we can be critical of.
Mm-hmm.
However, the critical nature of that doesn't compare to anything that we're talking about for a lot of the other places around the world. Like every single society needs things to work on, to better themselves. And it's not my goal to sit there and say this is perfection or anything. Not even close. But what I do say is that those things exist here.
Yeah, that's the underlying idea. They didn't just pop out of thin air when old Chris came across the big pond. You know what I mean? Like they were here.
Yeah, Chrissy and his cabal come running over and gave us all this stuff. He didn't give us anything. He didn't give us land. He didn't give us democracy. He didn't give us freedom. He didn't give it. As a matter of fact, the exact opposite. So in order for a lot of people to share and really enjoy these things, a lot of people don't understand that other people had to be marginalized, put aside, and oftentimes very harsh and unapologetic and kind of what you were supposed to do during that era. Again, it's not. I'm not trying to judge anybody today. Like that's not. I'm not a judgy guy. If you actually think that was great and you think that's awesome, I'm gonna look at you and be like, man, I don't know if I really want to hang out with you because you're that kind of sociopathic.
Yeah, I see you like you're missing some context clues here.
Yeah, but back then, being a sociopath, being a person who was really into this stuff was, hey, that's just what you did. It was who you are. It was how you identified. Not for everybody.
I talked to a couple months back. I talked to Mark Charles. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he's a Navajo
ran for president.
citizen, right? What ran for president, stuff like that. And he talked a lot about the idea of the Doctrine of Discovery and basically how Europeans were essentially imbued with the belief that God had given them the divine right to go and discover undiscovered lands. And I think there's an attitude of arrogance that came with that, as one would think if they truly were convinced that they were the messenger of God and the savior of the world. And I think that a lot of that arrogance is what kind of created the powder keg that was Christopher Columbus, and that was this sort of westward expansion in the way that people just came in.
Let's talk about it, because the reason why the Doctrine of Discovery exists is historical in a couple key areas that then had all these other productions. So you know about Istanbul and Constantinople, right? I think They Might Be Giants wrote a song about it. You know that song.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you don't know about this history, I'm not going to bore you to tears about it. However, Constantinople was the seat of power for the Roman, Holy Roman Empire. It was massive. It controlled all this great stuff. It had a tremendous amount of influence. And they had walls that they were impenetrable, been attacked, sieged for 200 some odd years. And each time they rebuffed them and kind of came back. However, I'm not really sure what the specifics were that kind of diminished the empire's role of the Holy Roman Empire. However, one thing is clear is that technology and other types of new stuff kind of came into play, and the will to promote a new style and you just came from the religion class.
Sure did.
A new a new type of religion was on the rise in that area, and it produced this fanatic push to kind of push out this other religion that was kind of pressing against each other. So this clash of cultures, and a lot of people have written about it. It's not up to me to kind of, you know, tell about their tale. However, what that did was that affected the world, because once Constantinople fell, it seemed like, you know, the European countries who observed that were like, whoa, what's going on? I can't actually go and attack because I don't have this anymore.
Right.
And I lost my access to the Caspian Sea. I lost my access to these interior trade routes to the Siberia, and I don't want to trade with these, you know, these people anymore. So we're going to create these new things, and that's when you see people shifting their focus from interior countries type stuff to try to go around Africa and et cetera, and move out and start getting in these ships and start sailing around. And that's when you see the Canary Islands being attacked. That's when you see full-scale colonization start to take hold across places like Ireland, et cetera. So there's this ripple effect, and it has its core base in religion and the attack on the principles of the Roman Empire. The Catholic Church itself could never be seen as being weak or whatever. So they just go and say, we're just going to go around the world and pick on everybody but the people who actually did this other thing.
Exactly. Like, we've fallen, but we must save face. So instead of dealing with the issues, we're gonna run, but we're gonna spin it, right? We're gonna spin it like this is what good God's plan was.
God will never let this happen to us.
Nope.
Pass these papal bulls saying we're the greatest.
Yep.
And nobody was really paying attention to the papal bulls, by the way. Nobody really was.
Nope.
Except for people who wanted to have the colonial extraction model. They wanted to get access to slaves because the fall of the fighting and all that stuff is really what disrupted slave trade. So keep in mind that Europe has tons of slaves in this area. It's in the Catholic like dictums and stuff. It's quite odd. And I just had this big talk about like, what are the big three sins of the United States? Well, they accepted all three big sins from their European counterparts, and that was slavery. And their specific choice was chattel slavery, which is brutal. It's the worst kind. And it included Indigenous peoples. We'll talk about that. Indigenous peoples were for a long time were the ones who were primarily enslaved. And then you had the second sin is land theft. So you have this like, hey, we're gonna take this land for some reason. And then the third sin is genocide. So they accepted all three of those sins from their European counterparts and just said, hey, like father, like son, we're going to take these on and we're going to do it better. We're going to do it American style.
That's such it brings like a really crisp point to the conversation too, because those are very specific things, like you said, they're intrinsic to American history. And so I have to laugh when I hear phrases like "make America great again" or something, because like we're talking like great for who, when, why, and how, because we brought with us those three things. We did that, and it brings us to the point where we even have to have this conversation today, because I mean, we're in a world now where people don't know real history about what happened. It's been packaged in a certain way. It's been packaged in a Eurocentric way, to the point where honestly, some people don't even know that Native people still exist, right? Like that's a thing. And these sort of colonizer ways, these three big sins brought us to the point where we literally have to have this conversation because so many people are so unaware.
Yeah, so I'll go back to the earlier point of, what is, colonization, settler colonialism, and tie it into what you just talked about, because when we talk about resource extraction, we're also talking about the extraction of ideas and the repackaging of those ideas as if they come from a very specific thing. And that's the story that's really done the most tremendous harm. So it's not just about the theft of the land. When I talk about theft of land, I'm talking about theft of the corn, theft of the tomato, theft of the potato plant, theft of all this other crazy stuff. And it's not assimilation. It's not like they took it and were like, oh well, we got this stuff, but it's not really ours, and so we're going to assimilate into our culture. No, they said mine, ours.
Yep.
It's now ours. We now have it. It's our idea. We're going to package it. We're going to do these things to it, and it's about a possessory model of colonialism that in this time, and then when you start moving towards the industrial age, it just ramps right up, and now you need more people. Now you need more access to all these other things, and so you pull in all these people. You make these justifications and excuses to just bring people in. I look at what is the American experience generally? Is it the Oregon Trail, people going across the Oregon Trail, or is it just them crossing a pond? Is it just them crossing a lake, a big ocean? Is that the real tale? Because they want to tell the story of Oregon Trail.
Right.
But the real tale is people traverse vast amounts of bodies of water in ways in order to get here for the specific purpose of getting access to specific pieces of land and participate in the big three sins. But they weren't couched as sins. They were seen as virtues at the time. Now we look back, only one thing is still not a sin. So one thing is looked at and is left there. And that's the perpetual occupation of land with no ties to the indigenous occupancy, no ties to that homeland. So
what nuance do you think that it adds to the conversation to look at that sort of delineation between Oregon Trail ideology and crossing the ocean ideology? Like, why is it important to draw that line in your head?
Well, because we're talking about Columbus and Indigenous Peoples Day. So Columbus, everybody is like, yeah, he crossed that ocean, but I'm the Oregon Trail person. And that's what I look at. That's where a lot of people look at Columbus, and I don't blame him because he's a genocidal maniac, right? However, he's the guy who crosses the ocean. Like, he sets that trend. He's not Oregon Trail. He sets that trend. And within that trend is what the majority of people's, 1, 2, 3, 4 generations ago or less, right? That was their story, or their current story, in some kind of story. And that's the model. Christopher Columbus is the model for getting access to the big three. Now, one thing, we don't do slavery anymore.
Right.
And
theoretically, we could argue the 13th Amendment, but
well, yeah, I look at economic slavery. So there's another model here, and we'll get all crazy, but I gave you a little text about it in an email prior to this meeting. But
yeah,
so I connect all those big three historically to the current practices today. But that's a 5-hour conversation that you probably take my class.
Right, this is the plug. Take my class.
That's my class. Take my class. If you need to know, it'll be in the comments section.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Yes.
That's an interesting distinction, though, because it does allow people to draw some separation or distancing that could perhaps allow people to sort of disavow how we got to where we are and why that part of the conversation is just as important.
Right. So here's part of my thing is say, what is the Indigenous people's perspective of how this is happening? A lot of times I call it a shallow perspective, where you look at Columbus and just say genocidal maniac, easy, A to B. And then a little bit more of a mid-level dive, maybe go down with your snorkel, go down without the air tanks, go down in the water a little bit more. And you look and see, well, the real history, the complications, what's the real things that are motivating this individual? Was it just Christopher Columbus? Is he just the scapegoat for these larger practices, et cetera? And all that's true as well. So that's the next Indigenous people's kind of perspective is, hey, Christopher Columbus is the person who crosses the water, and then that's seen, and when you celebrate those things, that's seen as a way to say colonization's okay, that the perpetual colonization extraction model is good. It's seen as this value system. And Indigenous people look at that and say, that's weird. What's going on? You're basically saying I shouldn't exist. You're saying that I should be. You're telling me that genocide is still in play.
Mhm.
That's not. That's just the mid-level dive. Then we get down to the deep dive, deep culture of old Chrissy Columbus guy. That's when you get into this idea that there's these individuals who are being placed inside to act as representatives for this entire history, which then erases the other conversations that were actually occurring. So I talk about the Sepulveda versus De La Casas, the idea of the rights of natural humans, and those larger conversations that were occurring. And those are conversations occurring in Europe. Meanwhile, in Indigenous peoples' perspectives, you can see different conversations where people were coming over, and Indigenous peoples were generally, very curious, enlightened, wanted to share, wanted to have these interactions with people in ways that, in many ways, were detrimental to them because of people who was actually being attracted to come over here with people who wanted wealth, etc. And so there's all these travel narratives of like Cortez and De Soto and these other conquistador types. They talk about entering these villages, and people were just like, "Yay, hey, what's going on?"
Right.
And then they were like, "Oh yeah, give me all your gold." And they were like,
Mhm.
"What? Come on, dude, you guys are weird." Like, what?
Yeah, like we're coming to this with two separate conversations. Like there's almost an assumed good intent on the part of the people that are like being approached, right? And they're like,
Right.
why do you want our
Yeah,
gold? We're people.
So Cortez is like, and I'm fuzzy on a lot of the Mesoamerican stuff, so I get somebody wrong. It's okay. Just correct me later in the comments.
Sounds good.
So everybody goes, "Oh, Montezuma was an idiot. Why would he ever let this?" Because that was their culture, man. Their culture was to say, "Hey, how are you? What are you doing here? You're a visitor. You're a guest. You're someone who's exotic. You have these other things. Like, I want to understand who you are." And then the Spaniards are like, "Ha ha ha! We tricked them." Like, what? That's not a value, man. That's bunk.
That's how I picture it too, to be honest, too. Like in my mind, it's like this horrible, like satirical cartoon. Like, you know what I mean? Like you said, people were just naturally curious and wanted to be hospitable, and then they're like, "Gotcha."
Yeah, and we don't accept that today. We have this culture of, in the United States, we have this a gun culture, protectionism, and stuff like that. Well, why do we have that culture? Because we read these stories of these duplicitous, people who were unscrupulous and untrustworthy, and we put them up on all these pedals, and we tell all these stories, and then we wonder why we have all these intrinsic untrustworthiness among other people.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I've never thought about that.
Who doesn't want to act like De Soto and Cortez and just take whatever you want and bugger off anybody who gets in your way, or slash them or trash them or do whatever it takes to get to the top.
There's that saying like history belongs to the victor, right? Or like until the lion becomes the victor, the tail will always belong to the hunter or whatever.
Sure.
And you're totally right? Because we're telling the stories from this perspective of, this is how history happened, this like conquering. And of course, then the negative space of that own thing is right? Like you said, that sort of touchy, protective, like gun culture, right?
Right. So
Which,
now if I were to show up and act like De Soto at your house, you'd be like, "Get out of my house, man. You are not to be trusted. You are."
Yeah, and that's a fundamental cultural shift from how Indigenous peoples in the Americas like responded to people coming over.
And I'll take it one step further. Now, Indigenous peoples are punished for having that kind of perspective. An unwelcoming perspective is seen as, "Oh, well, you're nasty. Something's wrong with you." And we see this not just with Indigenous cultures. We see this with a lot of different cultures. We see this with different peoples. Just if you have been under the knife, Indigenous people don't necessarily have Stockholm syndrome. Let me just put it that way. Some do. Some understand it. If you don't know what Stockholm syndrome, just look in the comments. We'll kind of describe it later. Ask the question. But if indigenous people on a whole generally don't suffer, some I guess it's a degree, but the Stockholm syndrome is definitely not there where they're like, oh, I can't wait to get abused some more. I can't wait for, hey, let me help you oppress me some more. Then we may oppress our own selves, and we have another conversation. But indigenous people haven't taken on that moniker and said, well, and I think there's a real reason why, and because indigenous peoples aren't in the story. So because of the perpetual exclusion, because of the and so I look at, what's the future indigenous peoples is that's the insidious nature of settler colonialism is once you get to the true inclusion model, once you get past what they're going to say is post-colonialism, you're going to watch as the Stockholm syndrome starts to really take hold. And this, I think, is because of a long-standing desire to not have to deal with the perpetual conflicts, and also the enormity of understanding, what actually transpired, and then also trying to. So indigenous people have to learn a couple different things, right? So at least now things are changing, but for the longest time you had to have two things. You had to become the best at Western educational models, which is ridiculous. What the heck? Who came up with that? And I work in a school, so believe me, I look at it every day and I'm like, okay, I'm asking this student to become the best in Western indigenous stuff. Now, I was like, yeah, I can't wait to become the best in Western stuff. And I knew what it was. And I was like, okay, I get this. But that meant that I couldn't be the best at indigenous based stuff, right? There's a double burden there, right?
Right.
If you are the best at this, you're probably not going to be the best at, singing your songs. And I wouldn't say that I'm the worst at it, but I'm definitely a mediocre singer. So if you're coming to me for like, hey, Justin, how do you, sing me a round dance? And I'm just like, well, I'm going to turn on the song and then I'll try to mimic it, right? That's me trying to be my best now. Right. So if you want to be the best at Western style educational models that America promotes, then and then also you're going to have a longer path and more things to devote to understand indigenous based pathways, and that could be pan-indigenous, pan-Indian, meaning all kinds of people, or understanding your specific cultural ways, mores, etc.
Yeah.
And that's what the struggle is. That's what's actually occurring.
And I feel like part of the reason in the headline for this, I didn't come up with something witty, which I should have done before my 5-hour class. But I wanted to, I put in our headline, we'll be talking about why Indigenous Peoples Day is more than just a semantic change. And I think that's part of the issue is like you said at the beginning, and I had never thought about this before, but like you try to actually separate the idea of Columbus Day from Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think that there's sort of my own colonial being steeped in colonialism in understanding like it's not just putting down or disavowing what Columbus did, but it's actually an actual celebration and an understanding of the necessity that we have to learn what Indigenous people have and do and who they are and their culture, because if not, that erasure is deadly, because then the story just stops.
Right. So I ask people all the time and say, well, we're doing and this just doesn't have to do with Indigenous Peoples Day. It's just periodic conversations. And I'll say things like, well, who's your favorite Indigenous person outside of me?
Like, I obviously at spot number one, but
yeah. So I'm assuming I got a lot of fans out there because I asked this question, and it might just be feeding my own ego. Of,
right.
It's not, but the reason why I ask is because even myself, like growing up on a territory, like I knew all these indigenous peoples, but I didn't realize that they were supposed to be my heroes. Isn't that weird? So it took me until my teenage years when I started looking at activism perspectives, which I think what you were trying to get to. So a lot of people, and I don't try to discount that. If you look at Columbus Day and you say, I have an activist perspective, then you're going to look at it and say, I don't want to celebrate this. I want to celebrate indigenous peoples. And that's powerful. You're saying, I want to be, I'm making a conscious choice to be this, to not celebrate these things for various reasons. And there could be more, it could grow the more you learn. But I look at it and say, how is it that a young person can grow up on a territory and not have indigenous heroes that are all around him, or them, or her, or whatever? But when you think about it, they actually are their heroes. But we're told that these are your heroes. We're nationalized to enforce specific heroes upon the body politic, because that's how the American society is organized. So you're going to know more about all these people that you have no relationship with whatsoever, and they become your de facto heroes as you're growing up. Even people like Neil Armstrong and other types of people. I'm not trying to discount who they are, what they do.
Right.
What I'm trying to say is that the connection to them is lost without having that American perspective, subsuming or oppressing the indigenous identities and perspectives. So when I look at this, I say very clearly that knowing an indigenous person doesn't mean they have to be your hero. Right. But there's plenty of examples out there right there in your own community. You don't have to even go to the history books. Right. They're all around. They're all over the place, and they're probably doing amazing things. And you probably don't know about it. And again, it comes back to what I was talking about before. So there's indigenous peoples out there that are doing tremendous work within their cultures. And a lot of people look at them and say, well, they didn't graduate high school, or they didn't get a bachelor's degree, or they didn't get this stuff. And I look at that and say, well, I went out and got those things. But I got those things because I wanted to create space so that they can focus in on culture. That's what we need more of within our people. Knocking down the double burdens, knocking down the things that affect us. So why Indigenous Peoples Day? That's why understanding, what is it that Indigenous peoples are going through right now, without having to put indigenous peoples into the past. Now, if we want to talk about historical indigenous people, let's have that great conversation, because I know a lot of them. And I challenge everyone to go and take, I got a few books here. A few of my heroes come from history. And I'll start with this one. So her name's Zakala Sa, right? And otherwise known as Gertrude Bonin. But she wrote this pretty nice kind of reader book. It is called American Indian Stories, Legends, and Other Writings. It's not because she wrote the book, but because she was a music teacher at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And I don't know if you know a lot about that school. It was a residential and a boarding school right there in PA, just south of us.
Okay.
Just down by Harrisburg.
Okay.
They took Native kids from all over the place, all over the United States, and they bust them there. And a lot of Senecas went there. And she was their music teacher for a bunch of years. And that's where General Pratt was located. He had a philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man. Yeah. And a lot of people have heard that saying, well, that's where that was coming from. And she was worked there. And so she's behind the scenes in this space, essentially saving these young people's lives, teaching them how to be resilient and how to survive. And then she decides to take that show and offer it to as many non-natives as possible, and writes books for a non-native audience. But a lot of natives read it today because they see the value. So another person who even comes before that is a guy named William Apes, right? Or Apis. He's a Pequot guy. Right, there he is. He writes a book called The Son of the Forest. And if you're familiar with, I guess, books that are starting to come out from people who like W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So he comes out with his book. And then, so this is kind of those compilation books, right? Of course, he didn't come up with this with a title. Some editor came up with the title. It's fancy. And what he talks about is, hey, I am a mixed race native, and I'm trying to live my life as a Pequot in Massachusetts. And, you know, I'm trying to portray what it's actually like to move from this idea of the perpetual savage, and then also work in this space that's called, you know, America during his specific time period. Well read, well renowned, one of the most popular books of this time. Somehow, in our time, it's forgotten. We just say, well, you know, we got these other classics.
Right.
Which is odd because nobody read those other classics. They're reading this.
Right.
And you know they're reading it because some guy on the corner in New York City was standing up there with 300, 400 people who were illiterate, and he was telling them this story, and then people just be jam-packed, and he was telling stories about natives.
Oh, wow.
So, and I'll go to another person. So, George Manuel, he's pretty famous in our circles, but it's all about resource extraction.
Okay.
And what he says is, he argues in this book, The Fourth World, he talks about, you know, what's actually happening, and he's got the two-row wampum here, which I think is absolutely amazing. So this is global stuff. He's talking about what is the political indigenous reality, and how can we understand what that is. And we talk about the third world. We talk about the first world. I don't even know who's in the second world. I never found that out. Do you know?
Right. Yeah. I don't know.
I will figure it out. Maybe it's South Korea. I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah.
Somebody's in there. There may be a few countries in there. But you got the first world. You got the North-South divide. And then George Manuel comes out, and I believe it's in the 70s. And he talks about, you know, hey, yeah, 74. He comes out and says, hey, there's this fourth world, and nobody knows about it, nobody talks about it, but here he creates this whole new political reality, this perspective that subsistence economies, etc., those still have values, and the fourth world should be looked at as far as, you know, how can you stop extracting from them and start learning how to live within your means, how to reduce. If you want to have a capitalist society, fine, go ahead. But not everybody wants that. Make the choice. Who said that? How come I didn't have a vote every so many years? Like, we have votes here, I guess, but I don't know if they're for capitalism or against it. But I guarantee you more people would say, hey, you know what? I kind of like the subsistence economy model than the than this wholly I believe I'm gonna get Horatio Alger and make $7 billion
right
next IPO drop for my coding Facebook app, right? So, and then I'll get you another one. There's one that doesn't have a book. She's actually one of my favorite ones. Is Jagon Sassin. And if you don't know who this is, good, because she is kind of one of those hidden figures. Even in Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian stuff. So Jagon Sassin is renowned for promulgating, I think, one of the greatest philosophies in the world, and that is the philosophy of one dish and one spoon. So if you can boil any philosophy down to using Occam's razor to just one phrase, you win. And so she wins the greatest of all. She doesn't have a book. She has one phrase, and it's one dish, one spoon. And if I can just say that over and over again, and you're going to know what I'm talking about. That's how powerful this philosophy is, without even having to describe it. She's met by during the Peacemaker's journey for the formation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so there's all these people arguing and stuff. So they go to her, and she's known as the mother of all nations because she takes these people and gives them those specific philosophies that allow them to establish the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so she sits them down and she has them eat from one dish and using one spoon. And when you have to do that, you realize that you're in a shared model, not just for resources, right? You have a shared, everything that it takes to get to that point has been shared with you at that moment, And I think we don't do that enough. We do too many separation processes, right? So here's my dish, here's my spoon, here's mine. And if you have to share, if you are forced for subsistence-based, for your specific livelihood, if you are forced to encounter that, and I'm not saying that she's the only one who kind of comes with this stuff. I just think that that's our story, so I'm gonna kind of give it to her, give her the
Absolutely.
props. Yeah, why not?
Why not?
Yeah. So, and then the last one I'm going to go to is these are actually just books that were over on my wife's
just casually
over there, and it's Charles Eastman, and he writes a thing called Indian Boyhood. Now, here's where it gets complicated because Charles Alexander Eastman gets he writes a pretty great narrative of what's it like, because he was actually an Indian boy who lived in the wilds with his parents for years, and then was extracted and went to the boarding school process.
Okay.
He came out and became a doctor, and so he talks about that. He talks about, hey, I had this idyllic childhood, and I was removed from it, and I want to share that with everybody else. Now, some people, there were already these larger societies out there called the Society of Red Men. I don't know if you're aware of this or not. The United States has this fascination with Indians, and it's all about appropriating them, as you're aware.
Right.
Not necessarily appreciating so much, but appropriating it and becoming themselves. So you have this thing called the Society of Red Men, and it's across the East, and it's all these, fairly pronounced dignitaries and smart guys, and they run around and they do these weird ceremonies and stuff. A lot of it's based, on some of the Haudenosaunee and some of the 5 civilized tribes practices, and that's where some of this stuff kind of still exists. You don't know it until, and we can show it to you and maybe at a later date. But Eastman writes this thing called Indian Boyhood. It's a huge big hit. All these people kind of love it. And it's all the people who are in the Society of Red Men, and they're like, well, I want my kid to experience this. So guess what gets formed? You get this thing called the Boy Scouts, and they appropriate a lot of this stuff. But it comes from this kind of stuff. It's not like it's indicative of what people were reading at the time when they formed these things. And I think a lot of times we forget that it comes back to the model again of, hey, who's the natural man described by Kant? Who's the, what markets are they actually describing in Smith? They're describing what they're seeing, what's the most relevant at the time, what's the most powerful thing, what's the thing that they're reading, what's the thing that's influencing them the most, and then they're creating systems or organizations or other kind of practices that kind of mimic that in the best way they can.
That's so interesting. I'm going to ask you to do me a favor, and after this video, drop the names and authors in the comments, perhaps, so that people can look them up. I'll make sure to include them then in the description box on YouTube and in the show notes and podcast form too, so that folks can look up those important works, because I really do. I'm beginning to see through this conversation what you said in the beginning about emphasizing Indigenous people say as its own thing, right? And it's letting people have their own agency in the conversation and not. What'd you say?
And get it wrong too. It's okay.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. No. It's just I'm starting to see it a lot more now than I did before. So that makes total sense.
Yeah.
I have to.
Hold on. I want to make the final connection to coming out day.
That's what I was just going to ask you.
Yeah.
We're on the same
All right.
train.
All right. I felt your brainwave vibes
Yes.
coming my way. So one of the, I go all over the place, and when I was growing up, this area had, and it still does, it had an anti-gay society. That's what this is. It's a culture that, especially if you have like a biblical or any kind of other kind of religious background, there's this Leviticus, I don't even know what the thing is, but Leviticus, which brought up, you're like, Leviticus, whatever. And you're like, hey, Leviticus, I got it, right? And so the ideas, when I was younger, at least, was, hey, you had these large national conversations. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was coming out, and these the political conversations. So I went and said, well, what is it that's happening in Indigenous country? Like, what is it? What is our practice? And I found out I was fascinated because it's actually one of the most diverse segments of Indigenous cultures. And I'll try to find some of the works that's been written about it. It's fascinating. And these works go all the way back to like 1800s, et cetera. And they talk about like two spirits and people who have very specific roles in Indigenous societies and cultures, that without their roles, without these people, society didn't function. People, and they weren't just all, it wasn't based on an idea of, which a lot of people do, this reductionism. Right. It's all just based on sex or something like that. Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, the goal, the purpose, the mores, and the norms of these practices generally had nothing to do with any kind of sexual acts or genitalia or anything like that. So yeah, it was amazing. And now you see this in practice through things like the powwow. So we go to the powwows and they have specific actions where the men dress up like women and go out and dance the women's dances. And it's across all those different, it's not just the powwows. The powwows are just replicating what was already embedded in the cultures. Right. And all these different cultures had these practices. And then within the powwow, they brought them in there and said, hey, this is what we do here. Let's do it. And they went out and did it. And they've been doing these things for a long time. So a lot of times these performative things, they're not necessarily ways to come out because there isn't these large scale, negatives associated with them. Right. People are just kind of free to be. And so I look at, how is it that, and again, this might be a larger conversation as well. In my opinion, and it might not be academic, but I think you'll agree with me that Americans have become more like Native Americans almost daily, right? Yeah. They become more progressive, even though we do have these conservative things, right? These ideas that we need to hold on to these values or something like that. The reality is the more progressive understanding, how do we get along, how do we get better, how do we understand, how do we progress as people. I think that's a perpetuation of the influence, not only just of Indigenous cultures, but people bringing their Indigenous cultures into the American experience and saying, we don't necessarily tolerate this. You're saying.
And it's kind of funny because I see a lot of those trends, like people like farming is trendy again, and we're into that, and we're into subsisting off nature, and we're into including the other and having cultural gatherings, and there's such an emphasis on coming together over a meal. Like there are all of these things that we're doing that were perhaps from my outsider understanding, admittedly outsider understanding, but we're more facets of Indigenous and Native cultures, right? And we're like, in true Eurocentric colonialist fashion, we're like, look what we did. And you guys are over here like, bro, we did this so long ago.
Yeah.
Like, maybe you shouldn't have just killed us and we could have shared this.
That's right. I kind of like, and don't get me wrong, again, we are definitely not perfect. And we do adopt and adapt, and we do, even myself, have things to work on. I'm on my own journey. I need work every day. I need to look and read and see different perspectives every single day. And that's my goal. And I do, and I encounter something, I say, wow, why did I do that thing? Why was this part of my, identity structure? What was that about? And I immediately try to jettison it, but then it takes time to kind of move it away.
Yeah.
But, so I agree with you. So at some point, here's what's gonna flip. At some point, the American progressive is going to be so far out there that even the indigenous people are gonna be like, wow, what happened? What I'm trying to say is hopefully one day and we will look back, and we probably won't be here. Maybe you will, I probably won't be, but we'll look and say, hey, there was these times where we had these weird practices of coming out, and it does, and so the binaries will go away. We won't have good, evil nonsense. We'll just have a spectrum of understanding amongst each other, and a movement towards a reality where, as people grow and learn, they get to be themselves. And, of course, there's going to be boundaries, right? Yeah. But what those boundaries they won't be based on some antiquated thing that bonk you over that.
Exactly.
These objects of antiquity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But
I love that idea. I didn't disclose this to you previously, but I'm currently, I'm taking my Master's of Arts and Religious Studies with my concentration in interreligious studies, and I have my eye on a PhD in queer theology. Queer theology is an offshoot of queer theory, which is the idea that binaries are man-made and they're artificial in overall senses, detrimental. And so when you start talking about the dissolution of the binary, you got me over here going like, my heart is racing. I'm starting to sweat a little bit more.
Well, let's just change gears, because a lot of people think that I just work just on indigenous stuff, and to be fair to them, I do talk a lot about it. And it's not because it's identity politics for me. I think it's because that's something that I found interested in. When I went to a friend of my house, his mom had a book on her shelf, and I think I was like 11 years old, and she pulled it, and I looked at it, and I was like, what's that book? And she pulled it off and she handed it to me. And I knew the book because it was in my mom's house. It was on our house, but I never had the courage to pull it off the shelf. And she pulled it off and gave it to me and said, read it. It was much too dense for me. It was way too hard. It was American Indians, American Justice by Vine Deloria. But I remember reading the introductory paragraphs and just being like, what is going on in this book? Like, what is this thing? And I had the book in my book pack, and I put it in my backpack, and I said, I'll bring it back to you. And she says, don't worry about it. And I said, but I'm not that way, so I always bring it back. And I went down to my uncle's house, and at my uncle's house, I went up there, and we weren't allowed in my uncle's room, but this time I was. And we went in there, and he had this poster on the wall, and it said, Custer died for your sins. And it was a poster of Vine Deloria's book. Right? And I said, I just got one of his books. Here it is. And he was like, ah. And he goes, Custer didn't die for your sins. Custer died for sins. And he'd crossed out the 4. Custer died for sins. But so that was my introduction. That's the path I would take. But I'm not a one-trick pony, and I wrote I think, after kind of taking the stuff that I learn about all the time, and I wrote a nice piece, and I'd like to probably share it with you. It's called the hypocrisy of incremental inclusion. Ooh. And it's all about the ACT UP movement, right? The movement called ACT UP. I don't know if you're familiar with this. And
I am.
Yeah. So, and how how and why it takes, specific overt acts from a pretty large, even statistically, enormously large segment of the population, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, so I'd like to share that with you if I could.
I would be
Yeah.
I would be so interested to read that. I'm that guy that's like, your dissertation topic sounds good. Can I like read it? And people are like, who are you and where do you come from?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So it was actually an independent study that I did in undergrad that probably should have went on to move into like a PhD thing, but I ended up going to become an activist and fighting police officers.
Someone's got to do it, right?
Yeah.
Listen, you got to do it from time to time.
Yeah.
Well, Justin, I cannot thank you enough for your time and your energy and your insight. I know, especially as a student myself, I know that it's not an easy process to acquire knowledge, and it's even less easy to be able to take these big ideas that we talk about in the petri dish of the institution and to kind of bring them out into the world. And so I thank you for your ability to synthesize an incredibly large amount of stuff for us today. I could not be more appreciative. So
well, thanks for having me on. It's
absolutely. So say someone was really interested in you, they're like, that guy, I want to get to know him more. What's the best way for people to get a hold of you? Is there a way for people to get a hold of you, your work, any sort of things that you want to leave us with?
Well, I don't really do, it's not like I don't do social media.
Yeah.
I try to do those things like for myself and for
absolutely.
Entertainment style. If you want to get a hold of me, you can usually find me on the lacrosse field.
All right.
Or hopefully not as an opponent, because I will check. Right. But you can always drop me a line. I will put that in the chat. And I have to plug the class I'll be teaching at St. Bonaventure University this spring. I believe it's the introductory class for Indigenous Studies.
Yes.
And so if you are at St. Bonaventure, if you want to take a class, I don't know how that works. Just enroll. Just show up.
Do it up.
I'll do roll call, and if you want to do the work, I'll grade you. I don't care.
All right, perfect. And then if you want to get a hold of Justin, you can shoot me a message too, and I will make that happen for you as well. So that way we can preserve our personal or our public-private segregation there, but also make way if people want to get in touch with you. So I thank you so much for your time and energy, and everybody who's watched. There's been a solid amount of people viewing this off and on, and so I thank you all for your time and attention too. I would ask a couple quick favors. If you could go to conversationsofficial.com, scroll down to the bottom, all of our social media contacts are on there, so you can find our links there. If you could subscribe on YouTube, subscribe to the podcast, and perhaps check out my Patreon. I am attempting to do conversations in a more official capacity, and the only way that I can do that is with you folks' help. So if you can check out my Patreon, there's a way for you to make a small monthly contribution that would help to literally keep the lights on in this place, and perhaps maybe like feed me in my sleepless quest to make the world a better place without any sleep for the rest of my life. But if you could give any sort of like, follow, comment, share to Conversations Official on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, any of that, it'd be super, super appreciated. Thank you, Justin, for your time. Thank you, watchers, for your time. And we will be back here next week with more intersectional conversations about life, belief, and everything in between. Have a great night, everybody. Bye. This has been the Conversations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to get involved, feel free to join the conversation on social media. You can find us at Conversations Official on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to rate, follow, and share this podcast. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.